Hi, and welcome back to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're going to explore the tragic murders of John Greenwood and Gary Miller, who were both just 11 years old at the time of their deaths in 1980. The sad nature of what happened to these two boys was further compounded by the fact that nobody has been convicted for their murders. A trial did take place in 1981, however there were several problems with it that still have repercussions today. I am never graphic with my descriptions of crime scenes in my episodes. However, this episode does contain descriptions of a crime against children and will not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised. Whiston is a village located in the borough of Knowsley in Merseyside. It lies between the city of Liverpool, 8 miles away, and the town of St Helens, just 4 miles away. It's a relatively small village with around 14,000 people living there in 2011. The area is largely residential, however is surrounded by several green areas, including the now named Stat Mowers Park, which borders the village. During the 1970s and 80s, childhood friends and neighbours John Greenwood and Gary Miller grew up in Whiston. The pair lived on Raleigh Avenue with their families. John Greenwood grew up with his mother Barbara and his father John, along with his older brother David and younger sister Deborah. Gary had 3 other siblings, 2 older brothers, William and Ronnie, and a younger brother, Kenny. The 2 boys attended the same local school, Halsned Junior School, and were very close. The pair were best friends and spent a lot of time together in the neighbourhood around Whiston. In 1980, John and Gary were both 11 years old and enjoyed spending time with their family and friends in the local area. During August of 1980, the boys were enjoying their summer, and on the 16th of that month, they decided to go out into the neighbourhood together as they usually did. It's known that Gary had been at John's house and they left his home in Raleigh Avenue just after 5 p.m. that evening. They are believed to have walked across the car park at the nearby Horseshoe pub, and then crossed over towards Windy Arbour Road. They were then seen heading behind the Whiston Social Club. This was less than half a mile from their homes on Raleigh Avenue, and would have taken just over 5 minutes to walk. The social club bordered the Stat Mowers Park, and a witness later explained that they saw the boys heading towards the rubbish tip through a hole that had been made in a fence. The boys had not travelled far and were only a couple of minutes from their homes. For the next couple of hours, the boys remained out together as they had planned to do. However, at around 7:20 p.m. that evening, a local man named Herbert Rush had taken his dog out for a walk. He had gone to the general area of the rubbish tip where the boys had last been seen. Herbert Rush would later explain that as he was walking his dog, he noticed a man around 100 yards from where he was. This man caught his attention as he was squatted on what Rush described as his haunches and looked as though he was beating something on the ground. This seemed strange to Rush, who watched the man carefully. The man got up and then left the area. Rush decided to go over to where he'd been squatting to see what was going on. As he approached, he heard some groans coming from under some abandoned mattresses that were lying on the floor. When he lifted up the mattresses, he found 2 young boys who he described as severely injured. They had injuries to their heads and were in very bad shape. Rush ran to a nearby house and contacted the police. Officers were dispatched to the area immediately, and the 2 boys were bundled into an ambulance and taken straight to hospital. They both had very serious injuries, and it was clear that they would need life-saving medical treatment. It was quickly apparent in the local community that the 2 boys were John Greenwood and Gary Miller, that their attack had been violent and savage. Herbert Rush was also under the impression that the man he had seen beating something on the ground must have been attacking the boys as he came upon him. This was certainly a disturbing thought, as it meant that the person who attacked the boys may well have been caught in the act and was now free somewhere in the community. The boys' families were notified about the attack and their condition, and this of course would have been horrific for them to hear. They were given immediate medical treatment, however the injuries to their heads were extensive. Within 24 hours, John had tragically passed away from his injuries, and 3 days later, Gary also passed away. The police were now not just looking for a violent criminal, but a murderer, and the fear that someone like that could be in the community was overwhelming for the family and for the residents of Whiston. The question of why someone would want to attack two 11-year-old boys was now the main priority for the police, and finding this person was crucial. Merseyside police embarked on a murder investigation and began looking closely at the local area and its residents. Herbert Rush was a key witness and was quickly spoken to by officers. He had got quite a good look at the man that had been acting suspiciously close to the scene and was able to provide them with a description. He told detectives that the man was in his 30s, possibly 30 to 35, with dark swept-back hair which was described in the Aberdeen Press and Journal newspaper at the time as being Ronald Reagan style. He had been wearing a brown jacket and brown trousers. While this description was not a lot to go on, the fact that Rush could identify someone who had been close to the scene at the time was a start. The attack on the boys appeared senseless, and the police were determined to find the person responsible. To try and achieve this, around 100 detectives were brought onto the case, and tracker dogs were also dispatched in the local area. Floodlights illuminated the search areas, and it was combed for any evidence that may be able to help the investigation. John and Gary's parents were coming to terms with what had happened to their children and attempted to make sense of the events of August the 16th. John's mother Barbara told the Aberdeen Press and Journal about that day. She said, "John called for Gary after tea, and that was the last we saw of them. We got worried and went out to look for the two lads. When we phoned the police, they told us that they had found two lads that fitted their descriptions." It was evident that the day had been like any other for the families, and neither had expected something so horrific to occur in their neighbourhood. Initially, police could not understand why someone had committed this crime, and where they were now. A later inquest into the boys' murders was conducted at the end of August by a Home Office pathologist in Liverpool. The post-mortems conducted confirmed that both of the boys' deaths had been caused by cerebral lacerations and hemorrhage due to fractures of the skull. The boys had died due to being beaten around the head. This proved a certain amount of violence had been involved in the crime, and made it even more imperative that the perpetrator was found. Just 2 days after the attack on John and Gary, there was an announcement in the case. Police had arrested a suspect. It was reported that a 20-year-old man named John Cheeseman had been taken into custody and charged with the murders of John and Gary. Cheeseman lived on Hughes Avenue, less than a mile away from Raleigh Avenue, where the boys lived. News that someone had been arrested so quickly after the attacks was welcomed by the local community and the boys' families. The fact that the perpetrator lived in their community and was known to locals was also a shock. John Cheeseman lived with his parents, John and Irene, and as they lived such a short distance away, it seemed horrific that someone who lived in the area could have killed two 11-year-old boys. John Cheeseman was remanded in custody for first of all the murder of John Greenwood, and then at the time of Gary Miller's death he was also charged with his murder too. There was not too much known about John Cheeseman or the evidence against him in the murders. There had been restrictions put onto the reporting of the case, and therefore the public were unaware of many of the details. The only piece of information that was reported in many of the newspapers early on was that Cheeseman was unemployed. The trial of John Cheeseman did not begin until May 1981 at Liverpool Crown Court. There was a lot of interest in the trial before it began, and there was also a lot of speculation about what may be uncovered during the testimony. The trial was presided over by Mr. Justice Peter Taylor, with Mr. Michael Morland acting on behalf of the prosecution and Mr. Bennett Heiter for defence. John Cheeseman pleaded not guilty to the charges of the murders of the two boys. The prosecution alleged that Cheeseman had been the one responsible for beating John and Gary to death, and Herbert Rush was brought forward as a witness to explain that he had seen a man that looked as though he was beating the ground, but may now, in fact, have been beating the boys. Herbert Rush was an important witness, and the prosecution outlined that he had in fact witnessed the killer murder the boys. They pointed to the post-mortems that had been carried out, which stated that they had suffered lacerations and bleeding on the brain due to skull fractures. It's reported in the Newcastle Evening Chronicle on the 7th of May 1981 that Morland told the court, "Those injuries were consistent with their heads being banged on the ground. What the Crown says is that when Mr. Rush saw the man banging something apparently on the ground, Mr. Rush was in fact witnessing the killing of the two boys." The prosecution also stated that there had been an attempt to strangle John Greenwood with a length of cord, which was found under a railway arch nearby. The prosecution also alleged that Cheeseman had been seen by as many as 12 witnesses in Whiston Centre between 7 and 7:30 on the evening of the murder. These witnesses recognised him and were able to confirm that he was wearing a red jumper at the time. The prosecution outlined that this showed that Cheeseman was in the area during the time that Herbert Rush observed the man at the scene at around 7:20 p.m. The prosecution also had a key piece of evidence in favour of Cheeseman's guilt. He had confessed to the murders. It's reported that Chief Inspector Ernest Kelly from Merseyside CID interviewed Cheeseman 2 days after the murders had taken place. Cheeseman told him that he had been at the rubbish tip to collect bicycle parts and that he had seen and spoke to the boys. He told Kelly that John and Gary started to call him names and were swearing at him. He reportedly said in his statement, "They started to call me names, John and his mate. They started swearing at me and then I started to hit them. They carried on calling me the F word and calling me names, so I decided to hit them again. Then I thought one of them was dead. He stopped breathing. Then I listened to his heart. Then I got a piece of rope and put it round his neck. I thought the other one was dead. He wasn't breathing, he was unconscious." He also further added, "I don't like anyone that swears at me. They told me I was an effing bastard, and I told them I'm not a bastard because I have a mother and a father." He also told Kelly that he was sorry that John Greenwood had died because of what he had done. This confession was certainly alarming and suggested that John Cheeseman perhaps knew elements about the crime, such as the beating and the attempt to strangle John Greenwood. He was also seen in the village at the time that the murders occurred. There were, however, some problems with this confession that the defence were quick to point out. One of the first things is that Cheeseman immediately recanted this confession. However, one of the main points of contention for the defence was John Cheeseman's IQ and his understanding of the criminal process. It was known that he had a low IQ level, and clinical psychologists had assessed him as being below the level of someone who was mentally handicapped. Cheeseman was found to have the mental age of a 10-year-old after an accident that he had as a child that had left him with brain damage. The defence argued that this made him susceptible and vulnerable to any suggestion. Chief Inspector Kelly told the court that they were aware that Cheeseman was of limited intelligence, and that they had made sure that his father was present when the statement was taken, saying that they wanted to be very, very fair to him. He did, however, confirm that his father was not present at the time of the interview, however said he did ask him if he wanted to tell his father anything when he entered the room, before the statement was taken. Kelly claimed that Cheeseman's father exclaimed that it must be victimisation, and that John didn't commit it. However, he said Cheeseman stood up, grabbed his father and said, "No, Dad, I did do it." The defence underlined that Cheeseman had been interviewed with no legal counsel or family present, and this would have influenced his confession. They also stated that he was interviewed for a long time, and that this would have also added pressure to someone whose understanding was compromised. This, they said, was highlighted by the fact that he then recanted the confession. The defence also gave other reasons for why Cheeseman could not have committed the crimes. They explained that there were no traces of any fibres from John and Gary's clothes found on Cheeseman's clothes that he had been wearing that night. When cross-examined, one of the forensic scientists said it would be very surprising to find no traces of the fibres on the murderer's clothing. There was also no evidence of grass or debris from the tip found on his clothes, nor was there any blood linked to the crime on these items. Scientists had found no evidence linking Cheeseman forensically to the crime. The defence also cast doubt on the witness sightings of Cheeseman in the village. He told the court that the local village three-sided clock that many of the residents relied on for the time was actually different on all three sides. He stated that if witnesses were using this as an accurate time for when they saw him in town, then there could be discrepancies within their statements. There was also an issue with the description of the man seen by Herbert Rush. He had described the man as having dark, swept-back hair and being 30 to 35 years old. This did not match with the description of John Cheeseman, who was only 20 and was described as having long, blonde, straggly hair at the time of his arrest. The trial lasted 4 days, and the prosecution and defence began summing up their cases. The prosecution alleged that John Cheeseman knew facts about the crime that only the killer would know, and that he was responsible for John and Gary's murders and had confessed to it. He did, however, admit that witnesses had seen Cheeseman in the village, and not at the tip, at the time that the murders took place. However, this could have been a discrepancy with the eyewitness's timing. The defence told the jury that due to Cheeseman's low IQ, he would have been in a very susceptible frame of mind. Mr. Bennett Heitner explained that police officers flagrantly disobeyed a Home Office directive about interviewing people with a low IQ. He also said there was no forensic evidence to point to Cheeseman's guilt, and that actually all evidence pointed to his innocence. Mr. Justice Peter Taylor summed up the case, stating that Cheeseman had been described as an oddball, but a popular figure in the community. He explained that Cheeseman was a likeable lad who regularly played with younger children who were more his own mental age. He directed the jury that if Cheeseman were found guilty of the charges, he would be guilty of manslaughter, due to diminished responsibility. The case was sent to the jury and they deliberated for just 45 minutes before returning to the courtroom. The jury had found John Cheeseman not guilty of the murders of John Greenwood and Gary Miller. It's reported in the Liverpool Echo that John's parents, John and Irene Cheeseman, broke down in tears on hearing the verdict, and they were ushered out of the side door. John and Gary's families were devastated by the verdict and were now facing the idea that their son's killer was still out there. Gary's mother stated, "The killer is still out there. If John Cheeseman didn't do it, who did?" She also stated, "There is somebody walking about out there who murdered Gary and John. These boys did not beat each other to death. My plea to mothers around here is lock up your children. Whoever killed my little boy might strike again." John's mother Barbara told the Liverpool Echo that she will only allow her other children to play outside in the street outside where she can see them from now on. The mothers of the boys also considered that due to the close-knit nature of their community in Whiston, they would probably bump into the Cheeseman family. Barbara stated, "I suppose we will have to try and pick up the pieces as best we can." The Cheeseman family also addressed how they were feeling after the trial. Irene Cheeseman told the Liverpool Echo, "Thank God I've got him home again. God has answered my prayers. We won't be moving house. It's our home and we're not going to leave it. I know my son is innocent and so do all of our friends." The end of the trial caused a number of issues in the community, mainly due to the fact that local residents appeared to want to support both the boys' families and the Cheesemans. It's reported that the local community raised money for John and Gary's funerals in an effort to help the families. They also signed a petition that protested John Cheeseman's innocence before the trial. The murders really divided the local area in Whiston. Unfortunately, the tragedy was that nobody had been convicted for the murders of two 11-year-old boys. Newspaper headlines documented the feeling in the village, with the Liverpool Echo running with the headline, "Fear stalks the village where boys died." The tension in the village appeared to have come to a head in July 1981, when it was reported that a fight had broken out between John and Gary's fathers and John Cheeseman's father outside a local chip shop. Ronald Miller and John Greenwood were arrested on charges of assault, and were later released when John Cheeseman Sr. elected not to press charges. He stated, "I told the police to drop the assault charges because I felt the families had suffered enough. We all have." Gary's mother explained that the atmosphere in the village was the same as it was before the trial, as the killer is still walking free. Following the trial, there were also a number of questions levelled at Merseyside police. The fact that the trial had fallen through due to the way in which John Cheeseman's confession was carried out caused some larger issues. MPs demanded a full report on the conduct of Merseyside police officers who had investigated the murders. Mr David Alton, MP, tabled some questions to the Home Secretary, asking what would happen in light of the recent acquittal, and asked for legislation to make it mandatory for officers to follow the guidelines when dealing with people with learning difficulties. The charity MenCap, which helps people with learning difficulties, also lodged a complaint against Merseyside police for how the interrogation was carried out. Mr Alton stated that there were a number of points which needed clearing up in the case. The police at the time did not confirm if they would be reopening the case, but did say that they would look into the files. Years passed and John and Gary's murders continued to remain unsolved, without any new suspects or evidence being reported on. The case was once again back in the headlines in 2016 when it was announced that Merseyside Police's Serious Crime Review Unit were given some new information about the murders. Police began reappealing for potential witnesses from 40 years prior in the hope that they may have vital information to the investigation. Detectives explained that they wanted to try and trace two boys who were seen being assaulted outside Whiston Health Centre in July 1980. They were believed to be between the ages of 10 to 15. They also stated that they would like to find a boy who was named either Duffy or Cuffy, who was also between the ages of 10 to 15. This boy was believed to have been with the boys just before the murders, and he was thought to have owned a yellow chopper push bike. The police also told the public that they wanted to speak to anyone who attended Halsned Junior School or attended the 28th St Helens 1st Whiston Scout Group. It was hoped that there was someone who knew something about the murders who had perhaps been in the area or knew the boys. Information also emerged about other attacks that had happened on young boys in the area before the attack on John and Gary. It's reported in the Liverpool Echo that around a month before their attack, two boys had been assaulted, and a witness came forward to say he had spotted an older man attacking two boys outside Whiston Health Centre. It was also stated that a boy had been heard shouting for help on a garden path around 2 weeks before the murders. This boy had been located on Halsned Avenue, close to the scene of the crime. Sightings of a man with 3 boys between 12 and 14 had also been made in Whiston between 6:45 and 7:20 the evening of the murders. This information was important to police, even this long after the crimes, as it could be crucial to the investigation. This, however, is not the only line of inquiry that the police are following in this recent reinvestigation. They have also stated that they would like to re-interview John Cheeseman. It's been reported just this year in the Liverpool Echo that police may have some evidence and would like to arrest and re-interview Cheeseman again. This, however, is not legally possible due to double jeopardy laws in the UK. In the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, the ability to convict someone who had already been charged and acquitted of a crime was brought into force if new and viable evidence came to light. It's reported that Liverpool police discussed their new evidence with a lawyer, however were told that they didn't believe that it was compelling enough to apply in this case. Senior detectives on the case have since called for a drastic change to the double jeopardy law, something that John and Gary's family are in support of. Debbie, John's sister, made a statement about her opinion on the double jeopardy laws, and this was reported in the Liverpool Echo. She stated, quote, "Double jeopardy laws were introduced in England over 800 years ago. Just think how much has changed in 800 years. Isn't it time to scrap this ridiculous outdated law once and for all and allow officers to requisition an acquitted person when their investigation leads to it? My brother John and his friend Gary, both aged 11, were brutally attacked and left to die, bleeding and hidden under rubbish in 1980. Our families have suffered many, many years of pain and frustration. The double jeopardy law is still preventing us from getting the justice we so desperately need." Assistant Chief Constable Ian Critchley echoed these sentiments in his own statement about the case. He explained, "Clearly it's so important To lose two 11-year-olds is tragic, traumatic, and it remains with those families and shapes their lives forever. But to not have someone brought to justice makes it such an important case. We appeal to anyone who has new evidence that can help our investigation to bring justice to John and Gary's family to come forward. We support the family's call to change in the double jeopardy law. We've met with the DPP, and I respect their role, and him meeting with us and the family to explain the legislation and how it's applied and interpreted. And in hearing that, we believe the only way to progress is that for an amendment to the current Act. The dialogue is ongoing, and the families are working with us and a Member of Parliament in relation to seeking to petition for legislative change. The families of John and Gary continue to fight for the hope that they may in fact get justice for their loved ones. They and the police believe that this lies with John Cheeseman and changes to the double jeopardy laws. It's so important to remember that two children were brutally murdered in a horrific way, and that their killer remains on the loose. In August of this year, John's dad and Gary's mum both spoke to the Liverpool Echo, describing how this has affected their families. John's dad stated, "It's a life sentence for us all, and I do not have a day's peace from it. Anger and grief plays a part of my everyday life. I am missing him so much. We have not been able to have a normal life like most people do. John's mum and I were only 28 when we had this life sentence of heartbreak forced upon us." Gary's mum stated, "I feel I'm running out of time to see justice done. It's absolutely unimaginable the pain that these two families are still going through, and I really hope that they see some justice for their children." Police have stated that they will be looking into all tips that come in, so if you do know anything about the murders of John Greenwood and Gary Miller, please contact investigators on 0151 777 3100. Our Crime Stoppers are 0800 555 111. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and I want to thank listener Steph for suggesting it. I want to thank, as always, our Patreon supporters who really help to keep the podcast going. If you want to know about what we offer on there, including bonus episodes and ad-free early access, then have a look at the link in the show notes. If you want to support us further, you can leave us a review wherever you listen, or just connect on social media at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and also find us on YouTube where you can subscribe. Remember, if you're interested in buying tickets for CrimeCon, then use our code UNSEEN for 10% off your ticket. Let me know if you use the code, as I have exclusive bonus content for you if you do. If you have any suggestions for cases, I would love to hear them, so please do contact me on social media or at theunseenpod@gmail.com. I hope to have you back next time, and as always, I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.